Hello, everybody. My name is Roger Stevenson. I'm on the board of New Hampshire Healthy Climate. I want to thank you for viewing this webinar. Um, this will be recorded. It is being recorded now, and we'll post it to our website and to our YouTube channel. And we'll be sending it all to all registrants. This webinar is taking place on Ndakina, which translates to our homelands and is currently called New Hampshire and Vermont. Ndakina is the unceded traditional ancestral homelands and waterways of the Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land, water, air, flora, and fauna, and the beings who have stewarded Ndakina through the generations over the last 12,000 years. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Lisa Wise. Lisa is a specialist in coastal resilience with New Hampshire Sea Grant and UNH Extension. And Lisa is also co-chair of the New Hampshire Coastal Adaptation Work Group. In her role, she works to support municipalities, residents, and other partners to build resilience in the face of the impacts of a changing climate. Recently, Lisa coordinated the latest update, the 2025 update of the New Hampshire Coastal Flood Risk Summary, Part 1, which is the science report. Lisa holds a BS in Environmental Conservation Studies and a master's degree in Coastal Ecosystem Science and Policy, both from the University of New Hampshire, and she's a certified floodplain manager. And with that, Lisa, we're very grateful for your participation and look forward to your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, New Hampshire Healthy Climate, for inviting me to speak this evening, and thanks to all who are tuning in. I've been with Extension and Sea Grant for almost a decade, working primarily with municipalities, state agencies, and other partners to support consideration of climate impacts in planning and decision making. And so this evening, I'll be focusing on some of the water quality and health implications of rising sea levels here in New Hampshire. And the bulk of my work has been focused in the coastal watershed of New Hampshire, which is kind of this pinkish purple area, just to kind of orient us geographically. That includes 42 communities on the New Hampshire side of the border and 10 in Maine. And then if we zoom in a little further, the 17 coastal zone communities in New Hampshire, these are the communities that have some tidal influence. These communities play an outsized role in terms of the state's population and economic contributions. It's a really important region for our state. It's home to 11% of the state's population, supports 14% of jobs in the state, accounts for 18% of the gross regional product for the state of New Hampshire, and of course, provides copious, important natural and historic and cultural resources. It's an important place for residents and visitors alike, and we have a small but mighty coast. So coastal New Hampshire is a wonderful place to live, work, and play. And some of the aspects that make it such a wonderful place also mean that that this area comes with some risks from coastal flooding. So it's wonderful to be on the coast, on the ocean, and our tidal rivers, and that poses some risks to the resources here in our coastal zone. I wanted to provide a kind of a definition of coastal resilience. That terminology gets thrown around quite a bit. And I like this definition that comes from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services coastal program. It's a little long, but it I think encompasses some important concepts. So the concept of resilience really refers to the capacity of a coastal community or a coastal system to adapt to a changing climate. And this is measured by the capacity to bounce back quickly from shocks and stresses like storms. And also, and perhaps more importantly, the capacity to leap forward. So not just bouncing back to maybe the status quo, but also thinking about how we can be preparing proactively and thinking really holistically about resilience and well-being in our communities. So that is the framing that I like to take in my work where possible, thinking about how we can build preparedness to storms and also think about building long-term resilience and well-being in our communities. So for my presentation this evening, I am planning on talking a little bit about what we know about sea level rise trends and projections for coastal New Hampshire. I'll talk about some of the risks and impacts for water quality and health, and then mention some actions that we can take and a few examples. And if folks on the call have other ideas, observations, experiences related to water quality and health and flooding, ideas for actions we can take, I'd love to have some discussion later. So feel free to chime in. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat if I'm able to. And also we'll pause later on for questions. But Roger, feel free to interrupt me if need be, if I need to address anything in the chat. All right, so as Roger mentioned in the introduction, we have recently updated the New Hampshire Coastal Flood Risk Summary Part 1 Science Report. The New Hampshire Coastal Flood Risk Summary as a whole has to be updated every 5 years, required by state statute. And that requirement to update this resource is really important because the science and the modeling related to flooding is always evolving and improving. And so having this report updated every 5 years helps to make sure that New Hampshire communities have access to the best and most current information that's available. So the Coastal Flood Risk Summary for New Hampshire consists of 2 parts. Part 1, Science, which we just published late 2025, and then Part 2, Guidance, which we are in the midst of updating right now. There'll be a public comment period later this summer, and we're planning to release that in September or in the fall. So this resource is the updating of the Coastal Flood Risk Summary is supervised by New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services and engages a lot of state agencies in a steering committee. We've also had a science team that included folks both at UNH and at other organizations, agencies, including NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and a couple of consulting groups, Woods Hole Group and JFK Consulting. So trying to pull together the best available science that's out there and determine what is most relevant for New Hampshire related to coastal flooding. And let's see. So some of the new information that's available is updated sea level rise estimates through 2150, which feels very far away, but it's important for longer term planning. Groundwater rise modeling, we had some parts of the watershed were modeled, and we've got some new and updated modeling for groundwater rise that covers the whole coastal zone now. We have some coastal storm modeling coming very soon, and we also have updated precipitation trends and projections. So there's some new mapping layers on the New Hampshire Coastal Viewer. If anyone wants to kind of peruse those layers and check out particular locations that are impacted. And then we also have the guidance for how to use that science in development, as I mentioned, for public comment and aiming to publish in the fall. If anyone is interested in kind of receiving notification about that public comment period, I can put my email in the chat. It'll be on a slide later as well, and happy to add you to the list to make sure that you're notified about that opportunity. All right, so just kind of some bigger picture grounding on what we're talking about. I'm not going to get too in. I'm going to try not to get too in the weeds on some of this here, but just thinking about what is causing the sea level to change. Sea level is rising globally and also here in New Hampshire. And the primary cause is our warmer temperatures, because as the ocean warms up, the water expands and takes up more space. The warmer temperatures are also causing the melting of land-based ice, and so that's adding more water to our oceans. There's a few other factors as well, but those are the primary causes contributing to rising sea levels. And so as sea levels rise, this can cause above ground flooding to happen more frequently, even on relatively sunny days without a storm. And it also causes storms to be more impactful. So a storm is happening on top of more of higher sea levels to begin with, causing more widespread flooding, causing stronger currents. So those rising sea levels are really important for us to be kind of keeping tabs on and understanding what we're expecting in the near-term future and longer term for planning purposes. So in New Hampshire, there's a lot going on this slide, but this shows the tide gauge data in the blue line. That's our tide gauge observations, our measurements of sea level here in New Hampshire. And so we know based on tide gauge records that sea level has increased in New Hampshire from in the last century about 8.5 inches. And then our projections, we have a variety of scenarios out to 2100 and beyond. And we can think about, the most likely scenarios that, at least as far as we know right now, we've honed in for the guidance, we've honed in on the intermediate and intermediate high scenario. So kind of that yellowish color and that reddish color, kind of hard colors to describe, but we're expecting about another foot of sea level rise by 2050 and around 4 feet by 2100 on top of the water levels from the year 2000. So that at least gives us some kind of bounds, some likely bounds to be planning for. So another foot by 2050 and about 4 feet by 2100. The science report goes into a lot more detail on what kind of goes into these scenarios, these projections. And we also provide kind of the higher estimates just for awareness. Even though they're less likely, the scientists are looking at the range of physically possible scenarios. So the guidance that we're developing will walk through, okay, this is what we're expecting. These are the projections to use depending on what your project is or your planning effort is. And be aware that sea level could be higher in the future. So you can see that there's relatively, close agreement amongst the scenarios out to 2050, but they start to diverge later in the century just due to uncertainties in terms of human behavior and other factors. So we have some really good information to help us inform the short-term decision making and also planning for a range of scenarios out further in the future. And in terms of what's at risk from the sea level rise, this particular graphic is from now a relatively older resource. It's about a decade old. But the New Hampshire Coastal Risk and Hazards Commission final report and recommendations was a critically important resource that the state developed. And I include this because the same analysis hasn't been updated. There have been similar vulnerability assessments done for kind of particular municipalities or particular types of assets. But this one at least gives us kind of that full picture of the coastal zone and some of the amounts of property value at risk under different sea level rise scenarios. The blue colors are with 1.7 feet of sea level rise and storm surge. So that would be around maybe 2060 or so, 2070 we'd be expecting. And then 6.3 feet of sea level rise would be a higher projection than what we're expecting. So beyond 2100, but again, kind of that higher level out into the future is in that kind of yellow and brownish colors. And so we can see that we have substantial amounts of miles of local and state roads that would be impacted. We have critical facilities impacted, as well as conservation lands, natural resources. And so this just gives us kind of a snapshot of some of the assets that are at risk in our coastal zone. Noting that again, these numbers are from 2016, and so of course our numbers would be greater considering inflation and increased development in the coastal zone. So, in addition to the kind of above ground impacts of rising seas and increased flooding, Rising sea levels also push up the groundwater. So the groundwater refers to the water that's stored underground in soil and rock. Groundwater is a critical source of drinking water for many communities. And in the coastal zone, there's kind of this interface between the salt water and the fresh water. And as sea level rises, it pushes that interface closer to the surface. And this can cause a number of issues. And this graphic from US Geological Survey and Los Angeles Times, I thought does a nice job of identifying some of those issues. So basements can see increased flooding if the groundwater is already pretty close to the surface, if it's pretty shallow. So a little bit of groundwater rise can bring that even closer to the surface. And places like Strawberry Bank in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the historic buildings there have been seeing some groundwater, some basement flooding just due to rising groundwater and seeing that the water in the basement rise and fall during high tides. It also can cause the road structure, the kind of under layers of roads to weaken and cause more frequent road maintenance to be needed as that groundwater gets closer to the bottom of the road surface. Underground infrastructure can be impacted, septic systems, sewer lines, and underground storage tanks. So a variety of impacts of rising groundwater. And I would say in the last decade or so, this has really become a much more a topic that a lot of people are interested in. A lot of science and assessments have been developing on this front because we see the above ground flooding. It's pretty visible, but thinking about the underground impacts of some of this of the rising sea levels as well. It's less visible, harder to see, but we're getting increasing amounts of science and information at our disposal to help deal with these issues. Another issue that this poses is potential impacts on our drinking water wells. And so again, in this particular graphic, salt water is in the darker blue color, fresh water in the lighter blue. It's a simplified graphic, but this is a drinking water well pulling from that fresh water resource. As sea levels rise, it pushes that salt fresh interface up closer to the surface. So you could get some saltwater intrusion into that drinking water well. This also can be caused by overpumping or overdrawing from just the well itself, even in the absence of sea level rise. If you have overpumping, it can draw some salt water into that well. And so kind of the combination of sea level rise and overpumping, a lot of our coastal communities are starting to think more about this. Again, I mentioned there's a lot of information available now on the New Hampshire Coastal Viewer, some new modeling layers added just in the last couple of months. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just wanted to share a few screenshots of what that looks like if anyone does want to take a deeper dive, just so you know what is available. And again, if people have more questions, want some guidance on the New Hampshire Coastal Viewer, happy to connect afterwards. But the New Hampshire Coastal Viewer now includes projected groundwater rise caused by sea level rise. And so we can choose a sea level rise scenario, 1 feet. Again, that would be around 2050, or 4 feet, looking closer to 2100, or even higher amounts of sea level rise. And we can see how much the groundwater is expected to rise as a result. And so we have this color ramp here where the bluer colors are a lower amount of groundwater rise, and the warmer colors are a higher amount of groundwater rise. So this particular screenshot is looking at a 4-foot sea level rise scenario. So again, around the year 2100, what we would expect. And we can see the areas that are expected to experience rising groundwater and kind of the relative amount of how much groundwater would be rising as a result. The caveat being that the current depth to groundwater is, is variable depending on the location. So in some places, the groundwater is pretty shallow already. It's pretty close to the surface. And so a little bit of groundwater rise would, potentially have a bigger impact. In other areas, the groundwater is relatively deep, and so an increase in groundwater caused by sea level rise is probably not going to have as much of a noticeable impact. So one of the nice aspects of the information we now have available is that the modeler, Dr. Jane Knott, also looked at current groundwater depth. This is just modeled, so it's not actual measurements of, it doesn't kind of take the place of needing to measure your current depth to groundwater if you're putting in a new well or septic or other type of project. But it gives you a range of, the red color is where groundwater is currently less than 5 feet in term, again, just modeled. But the red areas are where groundwater is pretty shallow. Yellow is kind of that less than 10-foot range, so a little bit deeper. And then the green color is less than 15 feet. Anywhere that doesn't have a color here means that the groundwater would be deeper than 15 feet in this area. And so then the next piece that Dr. Knott put together was this groundwater vulnerability layer. So this kind of combines those last two layers and just shows how much groundwater is projected to rise in those areas where groundwater is currently shallow. So this really helps us, all that information, those layers are available, but this in particular helps us walk through and identify those areas that are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise and groundwater rise as a result, and helps us focus and prioritize assets and infrastructure in those places for further assessment. So again, there's a lot to dive into there, but just wanted to give you a sense of what information is available related to groundwater rise, and we have some great local information now that will help inform future decision making. All right, so that was a quick overview of the sea level rise and groundwater rise information that's now available for New Hampshire. And I wanted to shift gears to thinking about some of the water quality impacts that these processes have imposed for New Hampshire. So in terms of water quality specifically, these are some of the concerns posed by sea level rise and groundwater rise. So of course, the floodwater itself, the above ground floodwater, can carry contamination, pollution, debris, anything that's kind of on people's lawns or on the surface of the land, on pavement, when flooding happens, can get drawn into that. So some of the specific risks of contamination in floodwaters can be human, pet, or livestock waste, and household or hazardous waste if there are maybe chemicals in the storage tanks or things like that. So anything that's out there can kind of be carried through with the floodwaters. There could be other types of contaminants, and the main concerns from a health perspective would be infections, rashes, gastrointestinal illness. So that's kind of the above ground picture. And then below ground, with those impacts on underground infrastructure, if septic systems, sewer lines are impacted by rising groundwater, maybe corroded, or maybe those systems start leaking, you can see untreated sewage being kind of discharged into the water, and that could pose risk of pathogens. You could see excess nutrients causing algal blooms in nearby water bodies. We've seen beach closures due to bacterial concerns. So increased health risks from those perspectives in terms of the water quality. And then some other kind of health-related impacts from sea level rise and flooding. So in addition to the water quality piece, there's also, of course, the physical risk from flooding. So 6 inches of fast-moving water can knock over an adult. 12 inches of rushing water can carry away most cars. And so there's very real physical risk from flooding, even if it looks, like it's not super deep water. It can cause some safety concerns. You can see transportation interrupted from some of this flooding, healthcare and first responder access. We've heard stories of school bus transit being impacted in some towns, food deliveries, social services being interrupted. So some, kind of ripple effects of flooding causing interruptions in access to care. Mold can start to grow within 24 to 48 hours of flooding, and that can contribute to allergies, respiratory infections. It can aggravate asthma and other concerns. And so there's the impact both from the flooding itself and also dealing with the cleanup after the fact. And then, of course, mental health implications from either displacement, if it's a large flood event and somebody needs to leave temporarily or permanently, the stress of your activities being interrupted, financial stress of dealing with the costs. And then, of course, I'm kind of focusing this conversation on sea level rise, groundwater rise, but the other impacts of climate, increased precipitation, warmer temperatures kind of exacerbate these challenges as well. So I know I've really brought up a lot of challenges and negative impacts. So I'm shifting gears now to think about, okay, these are some of the challenges that we're dealing with now and that we expect in the future. But fortunately, there are a lot of actions that we can take at different scales. So I want to really highlight some of those actions that we can take. We can think about physical preparedness, so elevating or moving out of harm's way, doing emergency preparedness and planning, and improving notifications so that people know when they do need to avoid certain areas or consider leaving, or considering not leaving during a certain time if they could be exposed to floodwaters. At a municipal community level, we think about improving our regulations, municipal and state regulations, and a few in particular that are on my mind are floodplain management regulations, as well as septic regulations, thinking about, should we be incorporating groundwater rise into our the distance that septic systems have to be installed to provide a little bit of buffer. There's examples with incorporating this information in asset management planning, so prioritizing those roads or sewer lines that are most vulnerable to sea level rise, groundwater rise, using that latest information to inform where we're using our resources. And then, of course, outreach, communication, and assistance around safe post-flood cleanup. So no shortage of actions we can take. And I've got a few examples to share of some actions that we've been seeing in the coastal watershed to date. It's certainly not comprehensive, but just a few examples that came to mind. If others have some to share, I'd welcome those as well. So there have been specific groundwater rise vulnerability assessments done for the towns of Durham and Newmarket, and the city of Portsmouth is doing one right now, doing some groundwater monitoring. And so these really looked at a variety of types of assets in the towns and where those vulnerable areas might be, and identified some goals and strategies to help better prepare for rising groundwater in those towns. Portsmouth is looking at the latest groundwater rise modeling, and they've kind of mapped all of their sewer line assets, and to the extent of mapping identifying the actual material that those lines are made out of, and you can really identify which types of material are most susceptible to saltwater corrosion. So they're really able to prioritize what needs replacement or maintenance, and help focus their efforts and resources there. So some great examples of taking that science and really trying to take it to the next level to help towns do some planning and prioritizing. A couple years ago, there was a project called the Seacoast Transportation Corridor Vulnerability Assessment, and this included access to emergency services as a factor in prioritizing road segments to evaluate in that analysis. And so, again, trying to understand the network of transportation and which segments of that are most vulnerable to sea level rise, and what the implications of those impacts are for people, whether it's emergency services or commuting, for example. So again, another example of that, taking that science to that next step of assessment that can then inform plans and decision making. The town of Hampton has a program where they provide parking permits. They make parking permits available for residents who live in flood-prone areas where they can move their car to a public lot that is on higher ground when flooding is predicted from king tides or storms. So that you don't want to leave your car in a place where it's going to be exposed to salt water. And so that's one example of how the town of Hampton is helping residents in those areas. Hampton's doing many actions, but that was just one kind of concrete example of needing to move your car in these times of higher water. And then a couple of years ago, I worked with the Seacoast Public Health Network they were doing some emergency preparedness kits and workshops. So that was kind of an example on the outreach and engagement front. And thinking about individual preparedness or household preparedness, but also that connection amongst residents, because that's really, in some of these instances of flooding or storms, building that social connectivity is really critical. So a lot of, the participants of those workshops took some preparedness supplies away with them, but their dialogue at those workshops was also really interesting, just to share information, experiences, and resources. So those are a handful of examples, and then a couple more I wanted to highlight. There's a neighborhood in Hampton that these images are from a presentation by the resident Tom Bassett and Eden Berry from the New Hampshire Coastal Program at a climate summit event 2 years ago. And they shared about the experience where residents had been dealing with flooding during high tides, when there's a new moon or a full moon. So they're dealing with flooding multiple times a month, even in the absence of a storm. The storm drain system, the infrastructure there was designed in the 50s and no longer worked. And they were just really experiencing chronic flooding during those high tides. And also when it rained, the rain just really couldn't drain well, and the pond nearby would overflow. So the neighborhood's been advocating for help with this issue since 2006, so 20 years. And in recent years in particular, residents started to raise concerns about the water quality of the floodwaters. They would see, you'd have to walk through it in some cases to leave your house, or they'd, see at times folks exposed to the floodwaters and wanted to know, what the risks were. So they partnered, the residents and the town and New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services Coastal Program, did some water quality testing, water quality monitoring, looking for fecal bacteria, and found that more than half the samples that they took were above the DES threshold for secondary contact, meaning you shouldn't be walking through the water. And the good news here is that last year, the town installed a new drainage system here, a new drainage infrastructure, which is quite a construction project, quite an undertaking. And what I've heard so far is that it seems to be working very well in reducing the amount of flooding that they're experiencing. So a lot of benefits to that kind of project, both from a public safety and a water quality perspective. You're not getting that runoff carrying pollutants or carrying fertilizer into the water bodies, and you're reducing the public safety and public health concerns there. So that's one positive story. And then there's really a lot of co-benefits for water quality and flood resilience. So some of the actions that we can take to improve flood resilience also have water quality benefits, and vice versa. So this example here, this was a culvert in Newmarket on Bay Road. Bay Road is an evacuation route. And as you can see, this existing culvert was very undersized. So constraining the flow of tidal water up to the salt marsh back here, constraining wildlife fish passage, and causing flooding during storm events because it really couldn't accommodate that. And so partnership, many partners involved, resulted in this larger infrastructure that improves flood resilience. It reduces the public safety issue there, and also vastly improves the tidal flow, improving the health of the salt marsh, the wildlife habitat, the fish passage, etc. This example here is some revegetating buffers, riparian buffers in the town of Exeter. So we're engaging residents in planting, and that helps improve the water quality of the adjacent Exeter River, which is a drinking water source for the town, and also supports wildlife and other benefits, birds and pollinators for through that restoration activity. In that same neighborhood in Exeter, this was another stormwater management infrastructure challenge. It's a very dense neighborhood, and this particular intersection would see a lot of flooding during rain events, and especially in the winter with snowmelt, would inundate and then freeze and cause safety concerns for residents, folks who aren't really able to use their yards due to just the amount of water and the water really having no place to go. And again, this was also a water quality concern for the adjacent Exeter River. And so the Rockingham County Conservation District worked with other partners as well to install this bioretention pond. And that now collects water from this area, and there's a culvert now here that carries the water over into that stormwater bioretention pond and allows the water to kind of soak in gradually and then drain into the Exeter River. So it gets it kind of filters out some of those pollutants that might be in the water from the pavement, from people's roofs, etc. Fertilizer, it kind of filters some of that out before discharging into the Exeter River, and also alleviates that winter flooding and icing issue. So this was just installed in the fall. The construction was completed. So this was their first winter with that in place. And granted, it was a snowier winter and less rainy than recent years, but so far that folks reported substantially less, if any, icing in that particular area. So again, just highlighting some of those real benefits for flood resilience of people and water quality for our environment. So I think with that, I'd love to see, I have seen a lot of notifications in the chat, and I'll catch up on those. And if folks have any additional input to share about the impacts or actions that you think might be helpful, I'd love to pause here.
Thank you, Lisa. And let me just say a few things for folks who have witnessed this presentation and will watch the recording. All or most of the images that Lisa has used are local. So if you I want to emphasize the fact that this is a local problem. I do also want to remind folks that the new the Seabrook-Hampton Bridge that was approved by the governor and executive council is a $107 million bridge. It's a little over budget, but the executive council and governor approved it explicitly, contracting for building a bridge that may witness 4 feet of sea level rise in its lifetime, in its 50 to 70 year lifespan. So our leaders are certainly seeing that expensive infrastructure has to be planned for accordingly. And that just suggests to me, because the bridge will be above water in 70 years, but most of Seabrook and Hampton may not be. So infrastructure is is tied inextricably linked to public health, at least in my opinion. If the indirect health impacts of floods includes infectious diseases, diarrheal diseases, skin rashes, uh, infections of the eyes, ears, nose, and throat, and that sort of thing. Um, where do we stand locally or at the state level with respect to the the uh, the planning for infrastructure improvements uh, in in uh, in anticipation of sea level rise?
Yeah, great question, Roger. I I'm most familiar at more of the municipal level than the state, but certainly, a lot of the roads in this area are state roads. Route 1A, there was that Seacoast Transportation Corridor assessment done a year or two ago that looked at kind of the Route 1A corridor and the timeline for which segments are going to be impacted when. So that's kind of the first step is the assessment and really understanding kind of how much time do we have and which areas are most vulnerable and then what our options are. And in some cases, there's more options. In some cases, they're more limited. So that's kind of on the road infrastructure front. There's been that assessment. I imagine there's planning happening. I'm just not really looped in on that level. But there's also been a lot of work to prioritize culverts for replacement. So our culvert infrastructure, Polly, Polly from the New Hampshire DES Coastal Program, I'm getting her last name at the moment. She's been really involved in some efforts to identify a variety of criteria that to evaluate culvert infrastructure by and helping municipalities prioritize those because that's really key. It's like if you try to think about all your assets at once, that's overwhelming. But knowing what is most critical for public safety or whatever the priority factors are, being able to prioritize those so you can plan your investments accordingly and articulate those co-benefits. I know a couple years ago, the Seabrook wastewater treatment plant did a vulnerability assessment because that's in a pretty vulnerable area. The challenge is a lot of this infrastructure is by nature at kind of low points in elevation. And so they did a vulnerability assessment and they have done the wastewater treatment plant there at Seabrook has taken some steps to shore up the infrastructure on site there. I think there's probably some longer term conversations that are happening or that need to happen related to future locations of wastewater treatment infrastructure, possibly amongst multiple towns, so regionalization of infrastructure. So anyway, those are just a few examples that come to mind of the longer term infrastructure planning. I
Thank
guess
you.
one more is that the city of Dover included in their capital improvement plan, they have that's not to the level of like designing, but they have kind of one of their criteria in their capital improvement plan is related to coastal flood risk and pointing to that coastal flood risk guidance so that becomes more of a consideration more regularly in their capital improvement planning. So
And
that's,
I
yeah.
do recall that the city of Portsmouth uh, fortified a seawall down on Mechanic Street near one of their pump stations as well, and they used their own money. Samurai, I
Mhm.
see you have a question.
Yeah, I guess it's just to remind folks too that the infrastructure piece is very vulnerable, and I think you've all done a great job summarizing that. But a number of groups, including a grant I had a number of years ago, a NOAA grant, it's the most vulnerable residents where current and future flooding is predicted to hit the hardest. So I'll hand out the map we did later. I'll send it to Emily or something, but it really shows that both current and future flooding, the neighborhoods that are heavily impacted are the areas where lower income residents, mostly in Hampton, already live. A lot of people with mobility impairments who can't evacuate or, have a lot of trouble getting around as it is. And just sort of the human health, in addition to the ones you pointed out, Roger, it's just that it's really a social vulnerability issue as well.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for highlighting that, Simra. And that's been also, we have a program called Flood Ready Neighborhoods where we're trying to engage more at the neighborhood level than individual kind of parcels,
That's great.
especially as you can see here, there, parcels are so small. And so we really need to work together um, at a neighborhood scale, larger scale, and in originally kind of identifying neighborhoods to explore working with, we looked at, in addition to the physical vulnerability of sea level rise projections, also kind of social factors, because that's key. And it's the vulnerability and the capacity to adapt. People with less resources to elevate their home or adapt, prepare. The mobility question. So so glad you added that piece to the conversation. And
It's
thanks
great that
for,
you're doing neighborhood planning. And then in Seabrook and in Hampton, a lot of people in manufactured housing. And so
yeah,
I know you're working on that. And it's just great to see how long you've been committed to this and what is happening. So thank you. It's great to see you, Lisa, too, we go back a ways. Yeah.
likewise. Yeah, thanks for being
Yeah.
here.
Yay.
The other thing maybe I haven't touched on so much is like green infrastructure and protecting our natural
Yes, we
resources.
recommended that too. We recommended
Yeah.
green infrastructure, but other than I know the dune protection, eelgrass stuff, which is great. Do you know, Lisa, if anything is happening with respect to green infrastructure in the planning or
Mhm.
yeah?
Yeah. So there's kind of a similar trajectory, I feel like, of the assessment, planning, implementation. There's been a lot of work there was the Great Bay Living Shoreline Project, looking at what sites might be suitable for different shoreline techniques, again, to kind of deal with erosion and flooding vulnerability, as well as habitat, ecosystem health, water quality. My colleague Allison Eberhardt has been doing a lot of work with the dune restoration, trying to protect that natural barrier that provides such an important flood protective benefits, as well as habitat ecosystem benefits. And part of that is having a suite of beach profiling volunteers, really dedicated volunteers through the New Hampshire Coastal Research Volunteers Program that help monitor erosion on our beaches, which can then help to inform prioritization when sometimes there's sand available from dredging projects or construction projects. There might be excess sand available, and figuring out, okay, what's the most effective place to put the sand if we were to kind of augment the sand on the beach. So maybe a common thread amongst many of these stories is just having information available to help prioritize limited resources to where hopefully it might be most impactful, because resources are limited. So
Joan,
and
you have
then
your
I
hands
guess,
up.
oh, great. Okay.
Joan?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I wasn't sure you called me. I thank you for this presentation, Lisa. It's been really informative. I was completely unaware of the phenomena of sea level causing a rise in groundwater, which, so
Mhm.
much of New Hampshire is dependent upon wells that you have to worry about that aspect. But it drove me to a couple questions this recently. I just moved to Exeter, and the town had a major ballot issue this year, along with several other towns in the region, trying to enhance our water recycling capability, groundwater recycling, reclamation. And I'm wondering, does this phenomena have an impact on that? And are you providing guidance to towns that are doing a lot of planning around increasing their capacity because the towns have grown and they need more water capability?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. And I'd love to dig in more on the Exeter warrant article example. So the one example that comes to mind is that, let me see if I have it map, but this is kind of the extent of the tidally influenced communities. All these communities appeared, not the entire municipality would be at risk, but or exposed to groundwater rise, but that's kind of where some of the tidal influence extends to. And so there was a neighborhood in Newmarket that when they had a few drinking water wells that just supported that neighborhood. And they weren't connected to the municipal drinking water system, but they were starting to see some saltwater intrusion, some more salt not that it would taste salty, but just starting to see, in monitoring that level of saltiness, salinity was increasing. Again, it kind of goes back to that graphic I shared that, over pumping is a consideration, so over pumping was probably the primary driver in what they were seeing to date, but then they saw that groundwater rise vulnerability assessment for Newmarket and kind of saw that it was going to continue to be a challenge for them. So they actually were able to make the case to connect that neighborhood to the municipal water system because of that a combination of factors, the overpumping due to increased demand and the projections for saltwater intrusion, groundwater rise. So I think we're at with the new groundwater rise modeling, I think there'll be a lot more interest in those assessments we've just had them available for Durham and Newmarket so far. Portsmouth is working on that. I think what I've heard from Dr. Knott is that generally the most of the drinking water wells are not susceptible due to the depth and their location. But I think it's really important for those to be looked at, to kind of do that assessment and identify if there are some that are at higher risk than others. And then, yes, the guidance that we're developing will hopefully support both the planning process and the individual site-specific projects for infrastructure, et cetera, that here's what information is available and here's how you could consider it in your plan or your project. So long-winded answer to say, hopefully
this was like
that
$1
will
million
be
bond issue just for the planning phase of this. So it's a major project for this region. So you don't have to wonder about it. The other question that was in the chat that related to some of the phenomena you were talking about had to do with, is the area around Seabrook at risk? And what are we looking at from a projection standpoint and its impact of rising sea level and Seabrook?
Yes. So the Seabrook nuclear power plant. Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head the status of planning efforts there. I'm sure it's on the radar, but I'd have to, I think, get back to you with if I can dig up
They
some.
are aware that it is pretty much in the flood zone, not in the most deepest part, but certainly even under the lower projections. It's going to be touched by flooding, and they're aware of it. It's just a question, I think, like Lisa said, like what to do about it.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, so the original LiDAR maps indicated that it wasn't as vulnerable as some might have feared, but the science has improved. The sea level rise projections have been, if anything, conservative. And we have to take into account storm surge as well. And with respect to pollutants and the indirect health impacts of floods, beaches are closed and shellfishing is closed when we have heavy precipitation events because of pollution, because of E. coli contamination. Lisa, should we be thinking about contamination of shallower wells where groundwater is less than 5 feet below ground? I mean, is that something we should be looking at in the future for people in homes, given that the majority of homes in the towns that we're talking about are on wells?
Yeah, I think certainly having that awareness of the depth of your well and the depth to groundwater. Again, I don't the analyses I've seen so far, I think focus on public drinking water wells. So it would be, I think, an important next step to look at the locations of private drinking water wells and the depths. I think one challenge with septic and wells is just like data availability and record keeping from a while back. There have, I guess, one other positive trend is that there have been some efforts to improve septic regulations, namely like when there's real estate transactions requiring an inspection of that septic system. So I think that with regard to new infrastructure or maybe inspection of existing infrastructure, thinking about when are those points where it would make sense to do some inspections, some revisiting. It certainly can create some challenges for real estate transactions if at the 11th hour you find out something about the septic system. But again, it's sort of about protecting the buyer and protecting public health in the long term. So I think that there are also efforts in other states, planning regulatory efforts that we can look to as best practices as well, to inform our hopefully resilient infrastructure going forward. It's a lot for municipalities to manage and a lot of state agency support as well. But again, prioritizing our limited resources.
Summer, did you have another question?
Yeah, it's one that maybe it just literally unfolded in the past couple weeks, and I wondered if it might be something this group and maybe you too, Lisa, with Extension, might want to look at the intersection with water quality and skin cancer. And it's sort of a really interesting one because New Hampshire has one of the higher rates of skin cancer, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. At the same time, we want to we want to allow people to enjoy their outdoor natural environments and especially going to the beach and things like that. So they started a whole skin cancer campaign, and Dartmouth and the clinicians are giving away free sunscreens. But all of the sunscreens that they're educating and providing are some of the worst chemicals in terms of the environment. Now, some of these are more of a concern if you're talking about coral reefs and things like that, but a lot of them, like the nanoplastics, are just not good no matter who you are or where you are. So I wondered if maybe, given that our New Hampshire Healthy Climate Group has a lot of clinical folks, some education at least about consumer choice, consumer education, and maybe even, it's probably too late for this cycle, but if Dartmouth and everyone is going to fund free sunscreen, consider doing some that don't contain all of the worst ingredients, or at least letting people know they have a choice. Something like that could be really interesting, I thought.
Thank you for that reminder. And we're up against our time here, and I think that I think Mary had another question. I believe I put it in the chat, Mary, that I put a link to the New Hampshire Coastal Viewer for you there, and I hope that that's helpful. Joan has also put a helpful link into the New Hampshire Coastal Climate Summit coming up on May 26th. And that's free, and it's I think it's free, right? Is it still free, Lisa?
There's a registration fee to help cover lunch and refreshments and the venue. But we do offer a reduced fee option and a waived fee. And if there's any challenges or concerns or questions, feel free to reach out. So yeah, that's
Thank
coming
you.
up.
I encourage everyone to put that on their calendar. Yeah. Lisa, thank you very much for presenting tonight. And we'll make sure that we send the link to our YouTube channel and to this presentation around, and this presentation will be on our website as well.